So thank you all for joining today. My name is Nathan Piccini. I am the marketing manager at Data Science Dojo. And today we have David Stephenson here with us to talk about the 6 critical business skills for data scientists. And thank you. I'm not sure what is it, Sharon? Welcome to being a dog parent. Thank you. Yeah, that's the life, right? But we're here today with David to talk about the 6 critical business skills for data scientists. David is the managing director at DSI Analytics and the author of Big Data Demystified: How to Use Big Data, Data Science, and AI. So before David gets started, just want to remind everyone for questions today, please use the Q&A tab, especially if you're on Zoom, use the Q&A tab, and we'll answer questions intermittently, and we'll save any long questions for the very end. And if you're on one of our live streams, still ask questions. We have team members out there to pull them into Zoom and make sure they get answered. And then if you have any pet related, I'll call it nonsense that you want to talk about, I'll be on chat. So David, why don't you go ahead and we'll get started here.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Yeah, actually I grew up, my father is a veterinarian, so we kind of had nonstop dogs around us. So kind of appreciate the continued pet ownership there. Yeah, as Nathan mentioned, I'm going to talk about the 6 critical business skills for data scientists. Let me start by giving a brief background to myself. I notice the older I get, the longer it takes me to introduce myself, but I'll try and keep it short. I'm originally from the United States, from Pennsylvania. Went to school at Penn State and then at Cornell for grad school. So I did this sort of, the classic data science, PhD in mathematics, master's degree in computer science, went out into the workforce and have been working really in applied analytics for the past 20 years or so. So currently living in the Netherlands, but I'll give you a little bit longer introduction on that. So what I'd like to do is to kind of, first, to put it into context, I'll tell you what I'm doing now. Currently, as Nathan mentioned, I'm leading DSI Analytics, and this is a company that I started a few years back, about 7 years ago when I left eBay. And what I focus on now is program development, really helping companies become more data-driven. Some of these are small to mid-sized companies who are just launching new analytics programs. Some of them are larger companies, like an Adidas, which have large programs already, but they need help launching new initiatives or moving very quickly. So I'd say probably 80–90% of my time is spent really actively working in data science programs for different companies around the globe. More and more now, what's happening is I'm doing these data strategy workshops for companies who want at a higher level to know how should we proceed with road mapping and strategizing our data science initiatives. So focusing also at the executive level. In terms of project experience, I've done quite a bit across industries, across different countries, across sectors. And the reason I mention this is because what I want to do is I want to pull together themes that I've seen related to the business skills that data scientists need. And these themes really cross a lot of different sectors. They cross different countries, multicultural teams. And really through that, the last 20 years working across all these different areas, I've seen a lot of patterns coming up. So at this stage, I feel like I'm really ready to share, okay, what are the patterns that I've seen in terms of what prevents data scientists from succeeding within businesses, and how can we do better, right? So, as I said, most of the time I've been actively developing programs, managing teams of data scientists and such. About 5 years ago, one of my partners, one of the companies that I partner with, asked me to start doing trainings for them. They had a young professionals course, and they had these young data scientists come in, and they would give them all these training courses about how to do R programming, Python, SQL, machine learning methods. But what my contact said is, look, we need someone who's been around a little longer, who can help our aspiring sort of high potential data scientists to also master the business skills they need to be effective data scientists. And that's when I started developing these trainings and giving these trainings, which were really focused on the business skills. First at this company, then a few other companies like it, and eventually partnering with the Amsterdam Business School here in Amsterdam to help them develop some of their executive training programs for analytics professionals, right? So I've been doing this for about 5–6 years now. Up to now, I've been training several hundred different analytics professionals in business skills. And that's really globally. So what eventually happened then is I put this information into a book, right? So that's going to be the basis of the talk. And this is the fourth pillar of what I do at DSI Analytics. It's more sort of giving back to the community. Part of that is chairing machine learning conferences. So the Predictive Analytics World Series, I've chaired that for several years in different locations. Published Big Data Demystified, which was for executives, sort of that high level executive introduction to the topic, with the buzzword, of course, big data. And most recently, this book on business skills for data scientists, which is written for practitioners, right? And that's what I want to focus on in the next hour, is those business skills that are hopefully going to be most helpful for you guys out there as practitioners, right? Whether you call yourself an analyst or a machine learning engineer or a data scientist, regardless, anyone sort of working in that technical delivery space of analytics, these are going to be the things that are really going to help you throughout your career. So let me go ahead and get started. And I guess the question I would have is, if we were in a room together, I would ask, what do you think the most important skills are for data scientists, in particularly the business skills, right? So maybe you can think for a moment what you think those skills are. And often I'll ask people that, and they'll volunteer ideas. And I see someone saying communication. Yeah, definitely communication is one of the skills we'll talk about. I see it. Yeah, I see a number of people saying communication. So communication is going to be number 3, right? I'll get to that one. Definitely critical. The first one I want to focus on is the one of understanding your company. Okay, so this in some sense will be the first thing that hits you when you start. And what I've noticed when I've given trainings, especially to people straight out of school, is a lot of them feel really lost in their organizations. A lot of them are hired as data scientists, and after working in their company for a few months, even a year or two, they come to me and they say, look, you know what? I was hired in this organization and I still don't understand what they want me to do. Okay, I don't understand what my role is, what the company expects from me. And I'm seeing this is really common. Okay, so I want to focus within this skill of understanding your company on 2 concepts. One is understanding how you can bring value to the company. And then the second is how to understand the colleagues around you and how they're different. Because when we talk about bringing value to the company, one of the very first things you'll ask when you join a company is, why is it that my position exists? Okay, so primarily there's 3 reasons why you might be brought into a company as an analyst or a data scientist. One is the companies that need to have you there for requirements. For example, if you work for a bank or insurance company, there's certain tasks that have to be done for regulatory reasons. Okay. The second thing is if you fill a position which has been around for a while, right? Something where you've demonstrated value and they know they have to backfill people or get fresh talent in to keep doing something that they've been doing for a number of years. Okay. So this is something where if you're brought in, there's a very clear mandate. The third thing, and this is the thing that's really common these days, is companies that say, we need to do data science. Okay, we need to start doing machine learning or artificial intelligence, but they don't know what that means. Okay, they don't know really what you should be doing, but someone told them they need to hire data scientists. Okay, I'm finding that's a really common position. Okay, and if you're in that situation, then you also need to develop techniques of how to sort of survive that. Okay, so there's 2 kinds of tricks and habits to focus on in this, right? The first thing to learn as you enter a company is, what are the work habits that are really going to help increase my value to the company? Okay, these are going to be things they're not going to teach you when you're in your analytics programs in university, but some things that are really going to be valuable. And I'll give you an example of those soon. The second thing to sort of technique to learn is how to swim, how to sort of find a direction if I'm not even given clear goals. Okay, so this is sort of the first subtopic of the first skill. How do I bring value to my company? So let me give you an example of this. So for example, in the book that I wrote, there's 14 different tips that I give. And one of them in terms of bringing business value is something that I hear a lot at companies. Okay, and it's the idea that you should really focus on being a thought partner rather than what they call a data monkey. Okay, so I hear this all the time from, especially when I talk to senior executives at companies, Okay. They'll say, look, the data scientists that, in our organization, I'm very commonly told, if I ask them something, they'll bring me data. If I ask them something else, they'll bring me more data, but they don't really draw insights from that data. And what the executives tend to say to me is, I want my data scientists to be thought partners, so that when I ask them a question, when I ask them for data, they bring me the data, they bring me the chart, but they also take time to think about it. They take time to say, here's the data, and here's the insight that I think you can draw from it. Okay. Or here's the data you asked for, and I drilled into that data on my own, and I came up with an additional insight that you didn't ask for. Okay. But to make that a habit, to really become a thought partner with your business colleagues. Okay, so that's one of many habits that are really going to help you bring value to the company. Okay, in terms of people who end up in companies where there's no clear objective, you're in a company, you're not sure what you should be doing, you feel like you're spinning your wheels. Another thing I would say is identify those colleagues who are most willing to work with you. Okay, don't just come into an organization and say, here's a good idea that I learned in school, you should do this. Okay, because typically you're going to get shut down. One of these sort of life skill hacks for data scientists is when you're in an organization, there's going to be a dozen different people you could work with. From those dozen people, find the one who's really interested in your work, the one who wants to find out about the ideas you have and the techniques you can bring. Focus on that person. If you're going to do a project, do your pilot project with that person, right? By identifying that person first, you're really going to make a much smoother way for you to land in the organization. Okay, so these are just a couple examples of different skills that you can develop of how to land in an organization and find ways to bring value to that organization. Okay, but aside from that, what's really key when you're in an organization is to understand how to work with the different types of colleagues you have. So specifically, when you've got stakeholders in different departments, then you want to understand how they're different. Okay, so let me kind of illustrate how this is. Okay, when you're working with IT, these people are going to be very similar to a data scientist, but also quite different. So let me illustrate this with a thought experiment. Imagine as a data scientist, it's the end of the week, okay, and your buddies ask you, hey, how was your week at work? Okay, and you say, hey, I had a great week as a data scientist. Imagine what would have needed to happen as a data scientist for you to have had a good week. Okay, for me, I would think I had a really good week because I learned a new package, how to use a new package in Python, or I tried a different technique or something like that, or I sold someone on a new idea, right? As a data scientist, I want to try new machine learning techniques and I want to make them work in a company. So it's about experimenting and innovating and new things, right? Now imagine you work for IT, okay? It's the end of the week and you say, hey, I had a really good week. Well, what does that mean at IT that you had a really good week? Well, actually, if you talk to your friends at IT, a really good week probably means a deployment where nothing went wrong. Everything went as planned and everything's very stable. Okay. And you start to realize the people, my colleagues in IT, are really concerned about production environments being stable, no problems, no downtime. And if you can think about it, it makes sense, because if anything goes wrong with your IT system, these guys are going to get a call Sunday morning at 2 a.m. Okay. Now, how about in finance? Okay, imagine what's important to your colleagues in finance. Okay, probably what's really key to them is that all the numbers are exactly accurate. Okay, no mistakes are done, all the numbers add up. What's also really important to your colleagues in finance is deadlines. Okay, certain reports, financials and such have to be delivered exactly on time, especially if you're a publicly traded company. Okay, so if you go to your colleague in IT and say, hey, I've got a really good idea, your colleague in IT is going to say, is it going to break my system? Are you following the processes? If you go to your colleague in finance is going to say, I don't care about cool ideas. Give me the numbers, which are exactly accurate, and make sure I hit my deadlines. Okay. Now, what happens if you work with someone in marketing? Okay, your colleagues in marketing, are they the same as the people in IT and finance? Well, as it happens, marketing is a huge client for data science. Okay, marketing analytics is a really big and popular field, and marketing sponsors a lot of analytics projects. But marketing is completely different than both IT and finance. Okay, marketing typically has a massive budget, right? So some companies even have, billions of dollars in budget. Okay, but the challenge marketing has is they have very little insight into the impact of a lot of the spend they have. So if you give your marketing colleagues sort of an 80% solution, they'll generally be really thrilled with that. If you give your finance colleagues an 80% solution, they won't accept that at all. Okay, very different target audiences. What about if you talk to executives? Okay, executives, you have to understand also their perspectives. Okay, executives have a completely different mindset than a colleague in IT, because an executive has 100 different things on his or her plate. And when you make a presentation to an executive, it has to be something where they can very quickly switch gears, understand your message in just a few minutes, okay, without having the background knowledge. They also care about different things, whereas the IT department would care about the details. Okay, the executives want to know the bottom line. They want to know, what does this matter to the strategic goals of the company? Okay, you have to approach executives in completely different ways than you would approach the IT, the finance, or even the marketing. Okay, this is why it's really key to understand your different colleagues. So that's the first skill. The second skill is about working with your colleagues. And this is something which is really a skill which is general to anyone working in an environment. It's not about necessarily people in different departments, but it's more about how to relate to, like, your teammates, for example. So in the section about working with colleagues, there's really 3 chapters. And the one I want to start with is the one about cultural differences. Okay, if you're working in a small company within your country, it may be that everyone in your team is from the same country. Okay, the first job that I had, it was like that. But nowadays with data science, especially with larger companies, you're always going to get people from other countries, other cultures within your team, within your country, within your company. And this can cause some unexpected surprises. Okay, so let me give you some example of how this might manifest itself. Okay, so you suddenly notice that your new colleague takes a 2-hour lunch break. Okay, so these, by the way, everything I'm about to give as an example are things that I actually saw in my experience, and things that caused problems in the teams that I worked with. Okay, so I'm working with a Dutch company. Suddenly their new colleague from France is taking a 2-hour lunch break. Okay, well, what do the Dutch colleagues think about this? They think something is wrong with this person because he obviously doesn't care enough to come back from lunch on time. Well, then I have to tell them, look, in France, a 2-hour lunch break is really normal. Okay, or you notice that your manager doesn't seem to respect your family commitments. Okay, you notice that your colleagues are sometimes criticizing you in ways that you don't think are appropriate. For example, in front of the entire team. Okay, or you feel your new manager is micromanaging you. They feel like they're trying to motivate you in strange ways that seem just wrong ways to motivate someone. Or maybe you're getting feedback from your manager, and your manager is saying you're just not a team player, but this makes no sense to you, you don't understand it. Okay, all of these are sort of manifestations of how your culture may come back to give problems, within an organization. And if you don't realize that these are cultural issues, they can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of tension within a team. Okay, so being prepared about some of these cultural issues can really help you overcome them. So what I'd like to do in trainings and also in the book is to go through something called the Hofstede model. Okay, and this was actually a Dutch sociologist who developed the model about 6 years ago. And there's 6 dimensions to it. And I want to illustrate this cultural model with an example of Denmark and Greece. Okay, and the reason I choose these 2 is they're both European countries. But even though they're both European, you can start to see how different they are, right? So the first of the 6 dimensions is called power distance. Okay, an example could be, a question to get you thinking about this is, imagine you run into your manager's manager in the hallway and you have a brief discussion. Is it okay that you send your manager's manager an email, or is that not appropriate? Okay, this is an example of a question which depends on the power distance. So you can see, for example, Greece has a much higher power distance than Denmark. Okay, so in Denmark, a Danish culture, it doesn't matter that you're different levels in the company. You can assume that you're approachable. Okay, you can also relates to how you get permission for a project. Does the permission have to come from the manager, or can you convince people at a lower level? Right, that also has to do with power distance. Next one is individualism. Okay, so is your identity drawn from the community, or do you function independently? So here you can see Denmark is much more individualistic than Greece. Gender difference. Okay, gender difference essentially, and actually Hofstede called this masculinity, but that's a bit of a confusing term, so I call it gender difference. Essentially ask the question, should men and women have different fundamental characteristics and values, or should there be little difference between men and women? Okay, and this actually plays out in the workforce in some subtle ways. So for example, should you expect your colleagues to stay at work until 7 in the evening? Okay, well, in a high gender difference culture, people are expected to stay late at work. In a low, and the reason being is the with the kids, as opposed to both partners being with the kids. Also relates to motivation. Okay, in a high gender difference culture, you motivate your teams by appealing to their egos. In a low gender difference culture, you motivate teams by appealing to their sense of camaraderie. Okay, so really, this is something that does play out in subtle ways. Uncertainty avoidance. This is how comfortable are we with unstructured situations. Okay, you'll see a huge difference here between Greece and Denmark. Okay, and I've talked to a number of people here in the Netherlands where we see this coming into play. The reason this is so dangerous in an organization is because someone from a low uncertainty avoidance culture like Denmark, if they're a manager, they'll give really broad goals and they'll let their employees find their own way. They'll say, look, this is our end result. You figure out how to do with it. That approach works in a high uncertainty, low uncertainty avoidance, but someone from a high uncertainty avoidance, for example, from Greece or Portugal or one of these countries, they expect everything to be spelled out very clearly. So as an employee coming into a new company, you will expect your manager to be very detailed in what they expect from you. On the flip side, if you're an employee and your manager is from a high uncertainty, you'll feel micromanaged. Okay, so the difference in these cultures can also lead to a lot of frustration, especially between managers and employees. Pragmatism, long-term orientation. This essentially is, how much do we stick to principles versus taking a pragmatic way? And indulgence is sort of how much do we expect to enjoy life, enjoy work, as opposed to being kind of very strict and hardworking and not telling jokes at work. Okay, so you can see what happens here just between two European countries. There's some significant tendency for misunderstanding. Okay, now let me add an Asian country and a North American country. So here we've got China, the Netherlands, and the USA. And you might start to think, okay, the Netherlands and the USA, they're both Western countries. Probably they're pretty similar. Okay, and in fact, if you look at 4 of these aspects, the Netherlands and the USA are more similar than China. However, if we look at the gender difference in pragmatism, I'll see that the USA and China are actually very similar in gender difference, which means the motivations are probably going to be more similar between those two than they would be with the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a completely different culture in that respect. If I look at pragmatism, I'll see that China and the Netherlands are much more similar, whereas the USA is very different. Okay, all of these are going to manifest in the team, especially in the ways that managers relate. So what I do, like when I'm working with a company, especially in a team management situation, whenever I see a potential conflict between people of different cultures, one of the first things I'll do is I'll go to the Hofstede dimensions to see if something jumps out at me in terms of how those cultures are different, and to see if that might be the source of an internal conflict. Okay. Someone asked about pragmatism. Pragmatism and long-term orientation. This one's a little bit trickier to explain because there's 2 concepts combined. Roughly speaking, let me just give you an example of it. Let's say that I've got a company policy, and that's company policy we all know about. As an American, my tendency is to say, I'm going to stick to the policy. I'm going to be very strict. I have principles and I'm going to stick to those principles, even if they're not convenient. If I'm from a high pragmatic culture, I'm more likely to say, yeah, I know that's the rule, but in this situation, I'm going to bend the rule. I'm just kind of go with the flow a little bit more and be relaxed about it. So I saw that myself as a manager because I managed a team in China. And that was an adjustment I needed to make as an American to realize that, look, what I would consider as breaking the rules is in the Chinese culture much more normal in the sense of bending rules from time to time. Okay. And I had to realize that Chinese people I worked with were not unethical because they bent rules that I wouldn't have bent as an American. Okay. So it's a little bit of a fuzzy area, but it's something that I had to learn to appreciate. Okay. So that's the cultural aspect. That's the first of 3 dimensions of working with colleagues. Let me just pause to see if there's other questions because I saw a few coming in. And I'll also kind of look to Nathan here if there's any questions coming out. Okay, good. So Nathan posted the link to the Hofstede. Yeah, that's great because you can look up any of those in there on that Hofstede link. And that's where I pulled these charts from. Yeah, and the power distance also, you'll find that if you put the Asian countries in there. Interestingly enough, you'll see that Singapore, for example, as an Asian country is quite different than some other Asian countries. Obviously, Australia ranks closer to the UK in a lot of dimensions. Countries have patterns that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Collectivism, of course, you'll see that really high in Asian countries, but also in Latin American countries, right? So some of your guesses for these may not come true. Good.
Sorry, David,
let me move on.
There is a question about, and I don't know if you would actually know this, but how is the data collected to compare the cultures?
Yeah, that's a good question. Originally, it started back in the 80s, the 90s with a large survey sponsored by IBM. Okay, so that came out of an IBM study. And then through the years, there have been additional surveys sent out and it's been expanded. I think the last update to the model was in 2010. And of course, it's only one of several frameworks. And there's more and more books appearing which talk about it. There's a book by an INSEAD professor called The Culture Map, which is also really popular these days. I just find the Hofstede model useful to work with because it gives you a really structured way to think about it.
And do you know if are there any data sets available?
I don't know if the data set from the Hofstede research is available or not, to be honest. Yeah, but that would be an interesting thing. And of course, things, well, I could talk about this a lot longer, but I'll kind of stop myself because I know we're halfway through. Okay, so that's the first skill. The second skill is negotiating. Okay, negotiating is, of course, very important in any job. And there's some good books out there on that. There's a book, Getting to Yes, which is excellent. More recently, there's one called Never Split the Difference, which a lot of people are reading, written by a former FBI negotiator. Key insight here, especially as a data scientist, is to really focus on what your motivations are, your objectives are, rather than your positions. So a common thing that I hear from people I'm training is, how do I get a better salary? That type of thing, right? How do I get permissions to, how do I get admin rights on my laptop? How do I get permissions to deploy something to production? This kind of stuff. And of course, what I tell, especially with salary, I tell people, look, you're asking me how to negotiate salary, but really what you should be asking yourself is, what's your objective? Is your objective as a data scientist really to get a higher pay right now? Or is your objective to further your career? Is your real objective to be recognized for your achievements, right? All of these ways of thinking, these questions you have to ask yourself, are part of the negotiating process, right? So I've got a chapter on negotiating in the book. I've got also a chapter on office politics. Office politics is kind of one of the most difficult ones to write on because there's a lot of different things that people group together as office politics. A lot of misunderstandings that happen, whether failed communication or cultural differences. Often people call these office politics, whereas in fact, they're just misunderstandings. At the same time, there are a lot of hidden agendas or intentional miscommunications, which also fall under the category of office politics, right? So this is something to kind of be aware of in terms of a business skill. It's something to cultivate to a certain extent. Of course, our hope as data scientists is that we can mostly avoid office politics, but we do need to be conscious of it because it's a big motivator for people, for many people around us. Okay, so I won't talk too much about this. I do have a chapter in the book, but it's a slippery one. So that's the second skill, working with colleagues. The third one is communication, and this is one that a lot of people mentioned at the beginning, right? So this is actually sort of the longest section in the book that I wrote. And there's two aspects to communication. Obviously there's using effective charts and graphs here, and this is what a lot of people are focused on. But it's also really key to start with forming your message, right? And this is where I see a lot of people also fall short, is that even halfway through a project, they're not really sure what their message is, how to communicate what they're doing and why, okay? So we really wanna start with this, right? We wanna start by forming the who, the what, and the how that we're communicating. Okay, the who is your audience, and this comes back to the first skill. It's understanding what is important to the audience. What do they value? Okay, what are their goals? Okay, until we understand these things about our audience, we're not able to formulate a clear message. And also, as we'll see, we're not able to choose the right visual because different audiences will look for different visuals. Okay, finance is generally going to look for more tables. Marketing and strategy are going to look for things like graphs and such, which give visual concepts. And the second thing is what needs to be addressed. This is formulating our message, making it clear in our own minds. The third is how to make the presentation. And this is more the details of how to get the charts and graphs done, right? In terms of forming your message, one thing that I advocate, and also other authors advocate this too, is develop the skill of creating a 3-minute story around your project. Okay, so a 3-minute story is a really short narrative, which is going to cover the introduction, the topic of importance, the goal in your project, and your proposed solution. And something which you can write in, essentially 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you could repeat to someone in a convincing way in at most 3 minutes. Okay, this is a hard thing to do. I mean, I've done this for projects. It can take you hours to construct a 3-minute story. Okay, but it forces you to be really clear in your own mind why you're doing this project. Okay, the background, the importance, the goal, and that type of thing. Once you've got a 3-minute story like this in place, you can use that as your executive summary slide. You can use that as your quarterly updates for your department. Okay, and anytime you run into someone at the water cooler or the coffee machine in the elevator and they ask you what you're doing, you've got that pitch ready. Okay, so it's a really key thing to do as a data scientist working on a project, to be able to explain the value of your project in just a few minutes, but it takes concentrated effort. Okay, once you've formed your clear message, of course, there's going to be a lot of times when you're going to make presentations and need to present a chart or a graph. Okay, a lot of data scientists really hate doing this. They want to do the programming and they don't want to spend time on presentations. But we have to realize that we're spending weeks or months of hard work on a project, and we've got just a few minutes to connect with our business stakeholders and demonstrate the value and the insights of all the work we put in. So it's really important to master the art of making these presentations that clearly communicate the value and importance of what we've done. So it's really good to get this skill right. Okay, so like I said, this is the longest this chapter on visual presentation. This is the longest chapter in my book. Essentially, I have 1 or 2 chapters on this concept. A book like Storytelling with Data by Knaflic has a whole book on this, and books by Stephen Few. There's like 6 books on the topic, right? So there's a lot you can talk about. But let me just kind of illustrate a few basic best practices, and then I'll go into some broader techniques. Okay, one thing you hear all the time, don't use pie charts. Well, why is that? The reason people say don't use pie charts is illustrated here. Okay, if I want to look at B and D, it's very difficult for me to see which is bigger. Is B bigger or is D bigger? If I put the same data as a bar chart, I can instantly see which is larger. Okay, this is the reason why people say don't use pie charts or donut charts. Okay. However, what a lot of people don't tell you, and a very common mistake, is that people use bar charts when the differences between the bars are so large that the bar chart is essentially useless, right? The difference between the 2 and the 8 and the 230 here is so large that I've really lost my visual intuition from this. In a case like this, an area chart, for example, a square area chart, is much more effective because I still visually see the difference, okay? Here's another example, using circles charts. Again, it's an area chart, which lets me very clearly illustrate large differences. If I tried to use a bar chart in this situation, I also wouldn't be able to see the small numbers, okay? Other small techniques, a lot of people will put out bar charts with vertical labels. We know this hurts to look at, but we do it anyways, okay? Sometimes we take the effort and we say, okay, this is a little bit easier to look at. It still kind of hurts, whereas having a horizontal label, it feels better, even though we often don't take the time to do it. Now, in fact, they've done studies on this. Having vertical labels actually slows your readers down. It takes twice as long to read. Even with these diagonal labels, it's 50% longer to read, okay? So these are all little tricks that we can take into account. And there's dozens of these things to make better charts and graphs. But what we really want is we want systematic ways to produce visuals that are really going to be impactful and communicate clearly, okay? Systematic ways. So we don't produce something like this, okay? These are painful illustrations, okay, that people are proud of producing. Here's another one, very painful illustration, also useless. It's impossible to get an insight out of this, okay? Here's an example of one from one of my projects. This is the kind that I see all the time, okay? Like I said, I'm spending about 90% of my professional life actually in data science projects, so I see a ton of these presentations. This is pretty standard, and this is just the wrong way to do it. It's not clear. There's not a clear insight. Yes, it came straight out of a data science tool. Yes, I could explain it if you give me 5 or 10 minutes, but this is not the way to present data, okay? There's a couple basic techniques that are really going to help you, and let me just illustrate those quickly and say, please take the time to learn these in more detail. Get a book by Few or Knaflic, or get my book, or research online, because there's simple techniques, okay? First thing is decluttering your graphs. Instead of a table on the left, produce a chart like what's on the right. It's decluttered, but it's the same information, a lot easier to read. Take a moment to look at this one. You see what's happening. Okay, this one I came across on LinkedIn, but you see what's happening is by cleverly constructing this illustration, the producer of this is really guiding you through reading this, right? So essentially, you know exactly what you're going to focus on first. And then and in fact, when I read it, this is exactly what I do. First, I read this, and then I read this, and then it's true, later on, you notice this. This is the process that you want to own in your presentations. You want to have control over the order in which your audience reads your slides, right? So you always want to use what's called a visual hierarchy. Okay, the hierarchy is the order in which you're instructing the audience to read it. So let me give you an example. Here's a basic data slide. A basic text slide, right? Everything's the same here. Everything's the same hierarchy. For me to process this slide, I have to read the entire slide. Here's what it would look like with a visual hierarchy. Okay, so here I've got 4 different levels of hierarchy, and it's very easy to scan the slide to see what it's about and what's most important very quickly. Okay, your slide should always look like this. Okay, good. So that's the third skill, communication. Now we're going to so up until now, we've talked about skills that pretty much anyone needs, sort of even in your first year or two as a data scientist. What we're going to move into now is more the management skills, things that as you take more responsibility and more leadership, the skills that are really key. Okay, so the fourth one is managing stakeholders. So I mentioned that often when I give these trainings, I ask what people expect. And one of the common things that people want to learn about is how to manage expectations. Okay, how to manage the expectations of their stakeholders. And that's what I cover in this section, right? So, some researchers have said that, 85% of data science projects fail. Okay, so at the project level, 85% fail, right? So the question is, why is this and how can we do better in this? So, and I've also seen this in my work, a lot of projects that haven't succeeded, which is part of the reason I've, been developing methodologies to say, okay, how can I maximize the likelihood that a project I lead is successful, right? So this is a lot of what's gone into my trainings and my books, right? The first thing is launching the project in the right way, right? So here's a quote by Albert Einstein. Okay. And over the course of my life, I've seen a lot of quotes that are like by Albert Einstein. Whether or not Albert Einstein actually said this, I don't know, but I like it because it serves to illustrate my point, right? So the point is, if you had 1 hour to work on a project, spend as much time as you can really defining the problem and formulating it. Okay. So what I tell people is, if someone asks you to do a project in a company, if your manager comes and says, can you do this data science project for me? Make sure you really take time to scope it out, right? And so what I promote is this framework of this 4 conversations. It's adapted from management literature, but I adapt it really specifically for data science and some techniques that I've been working with. So what I recommend, if you're working with a manager who's asking you to start a new initiative, make sure you really level set with that manager at the start, and I do that by walking through these 4 conversations. The first is to understand the situation. Okay. Second is to understand the expectations of your stakeholder. The third is to specify the communication style you're going to work with. And the fourth is to secure your resources, right? So I'll do this in my projects. If I sit down, I'll actually pull out this slide that I'm going to develop here in front of you, and I'll walk through it. It should take you an hour or 2 to get through it. If you miss any of the aspects in this, it represents a risk later. So I'm not going to go in detail through this, but I will just show you what I cover. I cover, the risks, the backgrounds, and the goals as my stakeholder understands them currently. I walk through my stakeholders' expectations in terms of what does done look like? Are there things on the horizon that we have to avoid, calendar events, timeline, how to prioritize it, and how they're going to measure success. I'll talk about how the stakeholder expects to communicate, the frequency and such, and I'll talk about resources. And in terms of resources, probably the most key thing, and what I really like to emphasize to people, is to get the resources in place that you'll need to finish the project. So I use what's called the Rasky model, but it's saying at the start of the project, look, I need to make sure that the staff in this company that are necessary to either do the tasks or to consult on the tasks, those staff are committed at the start of the project. Because if you start a data science project and you don't have the staff committed to supporting you in ways that need to be supported, then your project is going to fail. Okay, really key in terms of getting the business environment in place at the very start so that your project has the best likelihood for success. Okay, so like I said, this is the slide that I use myself when I start a new project. I think you'll get these slides later. If not, I've definitely got a link to this slide on my website. The next thing is the project kickoff. This is another really crucial step in stakeholder management. Okay, you've talked to your primary stakeholder, you've scoped things out in detail over the course of 1 or 2 hours. You've identified your RASCI and the people that need to be involved. The next thing is to get all the involved stakeholders together and have a dedicated project kickoff. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail about how to do that. I talk about that in the book and in the trainings, and that would take a little bit too much time. But I do want to say I've seen a lot of projects launched without a dedicated kickoff, and you're really there's a lot of risks involved to that. So you want to make sure this is done in a good way. Okay. Here's another quote by Einstein. In this quote, he's actually saying he would spend time on the project kickoff. I'm not sure if this is an actual quote. I tend to think that this particular quote is fabricated, but I like it too. Oh, communication. Okay, so the question of how do we communicate during the project? This is an old Far Side cartoon, which I like. I like to show this one also. It's funny because it actually communicates the opposite of what I tell people. What I tell people is you want to communicate risks. Okay, you don't want to hide risks. You want to build up trust by communicating risks, but you want to do it in the proper way. All in all, it's really important to keep strong lines of communication with your stakeholder throughout a project. And this ties into the whole agile methodology. If you're working agile, there's frequent communication points. Okay, that's one of the core pillars of agile is frequent communication. With your stakeholder, you also want to be transparent about the risks in the projects and keep the trust going. Okay, especially as a data scientist, because most people don't understand what you're doing. They don't know how to measure success or progress. It's important that you have strong lines of communication to reassure them about your progress. Also, because data science projects, there's a lot of risk in them, and there's a good chance that your project simply will not succeed. Okay, not because of something you did wrong, but just because the nature of data science is high risk. It's sort of like R&D. Because of that, also, you need to keep the communication so that your stakeholder understands the risks involved in the project progress you're making, right? Good. That's the fifth skill. Let me see, are there any, let me pause here if there's any questions. Okay, Nathan, do you have anything that's come across that I should pause for? Otherwise, we'll move it to the end.
There was one, Millie wanted to be reminded what were the key words of the parts to a 3-minute story.
Oh, right. So that's the introduction, the topic of importance, the goal, and the solution.
Yeah, and then the other questions I've seen, I think we can save for the end.
Okay. Good. So hold on, let me get back to this one. Okay. So the next one is delivering results. Okay, and now this is the stage where more than I'm at the project, at the leadership role. Okay, so at some point in your career, you may be managing the whole program, the whole data science program, right? And in this case, you've got the question of what should we as a team, or me as the program manager for analytics, what are the best opportunities for me to work on? Okay, and often, you know, your business is going to come to you because you're the one who really understands what data science can do. Okay, this is an exciting opportunity for you to identify those. So there's also a lot of room for creativity. But what's really important is that we start with the business objectives, right? Never start with the solution and then look for a problem. Always look at, start with the business objectives, start with the strategy and the current goals that your company has. Okay, it's really important to align with them. Once you know them, you can start suggesting the possible analytic initiatives that you're aware of, right? Then we can look at the data and say, okay, is the data available for me to actually create a model on this? Okay, if all three of those intersect, those tend to be the ideal conditions for your analytics project. Okay, it seems really simple, but it's actually an art to arrive at this point. What we're really promoting these days is design thinking methods, right? So really using what's called design thinking to really understand the business objectives and what tools are going to be most appropriate, right? So this is what I'll do in the data strategy workshops that I have, and what a lot of colleagues that I work with will do in other organizations, to use design thinking to get to this point. And we'll use like strategizer canvases and things and other canvases that we'll address as a group. Once I've got, you know, my ideal data project specified here in that intersection, then I can also think about the staff and the technology that's going to support that. Okay. I also have to be realistic in terms of, you know, where I'm at in a maturity spectrum as a company, right? So this is the Gartner Analytics model, which came out probably 8 years ago now. I think this is super useful. And to understand, look, I probably have to start at the bottom. You know, if I don't even have descriptive analytics or diagnostic analytics, those are going to be the first things I should focus on. Those are going to bring the fastest, clearest wins in helping me become a data-driven organization. Okay, I want to focus on those as an analytics leader before I focus on the more advanced things like predictive and prescriptive, the things that we think of as AI. Okay, really important. If you jump straight into the more advanced ones, you have a high risk of failure and you're missing a lot of low-hanging fruit. Okay. The second half of the delivering results scale is about how to get projects done, right? Definitely you want to be familiar with what a proof of concept is, minimum viable products, pilots. We need to progress through these stages in a healthy way, not to get stuck in any of them, but make sure we see them as the right stepping stones towards a final product. Okay, we need to understand the big picture, where machine learning fits within deployed software. So this is, for example, from a 2014 paper that Google put out called The Hidden Technical Debt in Machine Learning. That little black box is what we're working on with machine learning. Everything around it is the ecosystem that has to be in place to make machine learning viable. Okay. In addition, Google didn't mention the data health and the model health, which are critical. I'm going to come back to those shortly in an example. Let me just kind of show you a couple examples, well-known examples of how not executing a data science project can really lead to failure. You may remember IBM Watson, a fantastic tool, demonstrated its power by winning at a game show, Jeopardy. This is back in 2011. Here you can see how it's crushing, 4,000 versus 200, 600. IBM Watson is crushing the human champions that it's competing against. So what, of course, did IBM do? Well, 2 years later, they said, we're going to use it to, to fight cancer, right? So this is a great application of machine learning. It had KPI set out. It had a great business case set out. Fast forward 4 years, and the whole project was a bust, right? 62 million in lost investment plus all the time. Okay, so what happened? This is an example of a great tool with a great use case, but the execution was a complete failure. Okay, a very high profile loss in terms of an executed data science project. Okay, so we hope this was 2013 through 2017. We hope by now we better understand how to execute data science projects. But in fact, let me show you. First, let me ask you, as a data scientist, have you ever thought how much real damage could you do within a company as a data science leader? Okay, we tend to think of this as like, okay, well, I do a project, the project fails, I get fired. That's the worst thing that happens. But let me show you an example of something that happened just this year in terms of the amount of real damage we can do as data science leaders. Here's Zillow. Okay, Zillow is a company in the US which helps people buy and sell property, right? So Zillow had this great idea that in addition to advising people on buying and selling property, they would themselves start buying up property and reselling it. So what they did is they developed an in-house pricing model for how much a property should be worth, right? And they started buying it. Okay, this was 1 year ago. Okay, so Zillow with this data science project lost $881 million. Okay, and what they did is they failed to account for model drift. Okay, here's a news story from February 2021 where they're announcing the deployment of their model. Here's a news story 1 year later. This is February of this year, where they announced that they're stopping this program. They've lost 881 million, essentially because of bad implementation of a data science algorithm, and laying off 25% of their staff. Okay, so this is the danger we're in as senior data scientists if we're deploying a model which isn't working correctly, right? So it's something we need to take kind of seriously. Okay, on that note, the last skill, and this is really a skill that you'll develop all through your career, is how to build your career. Okay, so this is the last chapter in the book. I won't go again into details on this. Most of you are having tons of discussions with people around you about career development. There are a few habits you really want it to get into. What I see is a lot of people trying to build their career by taking online courses, right? This, I think, is not the best way to build your career. What I really recommend to people, focus on networking, focus on building your CV through experience, through involvement with really high profile projects, and through really measuring the success of what you've done at companies in a quantifiable way. Okay, things like this are going to make you much more marketable, I think, than simply taking an online course. In addition to sort of building up your career, the other thing I talk about is making your own decision about what you really want. Where do you really want to go in life? Do you want to be a manager? Do you want to really dive into a specific technology? Or Or do you want to go into more general business as opposed to specializing in a technical area? Do you want to work in a startup, or would you rather work in a very large company? All of these things are questions you need to ask yourself and keep asking yourself sort of as you're developing your career. With that, I've just a few minutes left. These are the 6 skills kind of summarized. Let me just stop and take whatever questions we have. I will kind of leave also with, if you want to get in touch with me, here's email address you can reach me at. This will be on the slides too. So yeah, with that, let me ask if there's other questions. And Nathan, I don't know if you want to sort of moderate that. And
yeah, so there are 2 questions if you open up that Q&A tab, the 2, and then filter by most upvotes, the 2 questions at the top.
All right, let me do that.
Are probably the most relevant. And then if we have time, you can answer the other 2 that are there right now, but we'll see how much time we have left.
Okay. Okay, so the first one I see is, are there any sources where I can read business scenarios data scientists have dealt with to familiarize themselves with real situations, projects in the industry? Yeah, so this is what I don't know of any books that do this. This is, of course, with the conferences, this is what we see all the time. Right, so, I mentioned I'd share like predictive analytics world. And this is something where you'll see, dozens of companies describing the situations they've been in. Yeah, so I would say that's probably the best source, but I can't think of something in terms of online searchable at this point. Okay, next one. How would you approach a project that's not likely to succeed as defined, but undergoing it will likely yield lateral benefits? Yeah, so this is good. And this is definitely where I would say, be transparent about that. I would say, look, this is what I see as the risk involved here. And I, as a consultant, often people will ask me to do a project that maybe is less interesting for me, but it's not my project. Ultimately, someone else is making the final decision, but I want to be really transparent about what I think is a good idea or not a good idea. And also tell them, look, here's a lateral benefit that could be helpful to you. And suggest that they spin into something like that. If there are no interesting projects in my company, how can I build a separate portfolio elsewhere? Or, for example, GitHub. That's a tough one. I see a lot of CVs coming through because I help companies with hiring. Some of those have projects on them. To be honest, if it's just a project you've done on your own, I don't feel it carries a lot of weight. If you contribute to a well-known project on GitHub, I think that has more weight. So I would say, yeah, if you see a project which has a lot of pedigree on the market and you can contribute towards that, I think that's good. If you can convince someone at your company to do a proof of concept, I think that's probably even better, although that can be a challenge. Yeah.
All right, and so that puts us at the 1 hour mark. It looks like, hold on, there's one more comment. Let's see if that's a question. Thank you so much. Yes, of course. So with that, I'm actually going to share my screen so that I can show you all what we're doing tomorrow. Let's hope I get the right one on the first try. Ooh. All right, so tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific, so a couple of hours earlier than today, we're going to be talking about a friendly introduction to codeless deep learning with KNIME Analytics platform. And if you were here with us a couple of weeks ago, we actually had a couple of data scientists from KNIME give us a talk as well. But this one's going to be with Roberto, and hopefully I'm saying his name correctly today, Roberto Cadilli. He's a data scientist at KNIME as well. And so if that's something you want to join, RSVP, join us on a live stream. We hope to see you there. But thank you, David, so much for being here with us today. And thank you everybody else for joining as well. David, it was really great talking to you, and hopefully we can link up with you again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks everyone for attending.
For sure. And big thanks to my colleague, Fatima Rafiq, who of course sets all of this up and and helps us with logistics and everything else. So hope to see you all tomorrow. And if not, maybe at another one of our webinars in the future.